Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
This deep dive takes us right to the bedrock of human understanding. I mean, really the nature of language itself. We're exploring the structure, the constraints, and the generative power of the human mind. Using Noam Chomsky's foundational collection of essays, New Horizons in the Study of Language and Mind.
And the central systemic question Chomsky tackles here is, you could argue, the greatest crisis in perception in cognitive science. It's this. Why do the dominant explanations of human language keep focusing on observable surface behavior, on external systems, instead of the underlying internal biological structures that actually constrain and generate our ability to speak and understand?
Right.
It's a crisis because we're looking outward at the product, what we might call e-language, when the true system, the I-language, is hidden inside the mind brain.
We're studying the shadow instead of the object casting it. That's a perfect way to put it. And this isn't just some academic debate for linguists holed up in an ivory tower. The assumptions we make about what language is profoundly shape critical societal systems. If we get this wrong, if we confuse the map for the territory, we risk misdesigning our entire educational framework, our tools for measurement, even our most advanced technologies.
Oh, absolutely. Think about modern education systems. If you believe language is learned purely through, say, extensive input and imitation, then your whole model is based on repetition, correction, rote memorization of surface rules.
Right, grammar drills.
But if it's primarily innate growth, just sort of triggered by minimal input, that requires a completely different approach to teaching, especially, when it comes to learning a second language.
It also directly influences things like intelligence testing. Now we measure cognitive ability. What if the language faculty is modular, a specialized organ that's actually separate from general intelligence?
And maybe the most relevant piece for today is how it defines the design and the core assumptions underlying artificial intelligence. I mean, when you build an AI that just scrapes billions of documents to track surface data, you are implicitly, whether you know it or not, adopting that externalist view that Chomsky spends this entire book dismantling.
You're betting the farm on behaviorism, basically.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're focusing strictly on the structural patterns, the inherent constraints, and the systemic outcomes that are revealed in this text. Our mission is just to understand the framework, to internalize the logic of this internalist perspective, not to offer advice or, pedagogical recommendations.
Yeah, we're analyzing the system, not prescribing a solution.
Okay, let's unpack this system of internal linguistic competence. To really get it, we have to start with the intellectual environment Chomsky that he was fighting against.
To set the scene, you really have to go back to the mid-20th century. Chomsky was the key figure. I mean, he was the driving intellectual force behind what we now call the cognitive revolution of the 1950s and 60s.
Right.
Before him, the study of language was largely defined by external observation.
He was the intellectual earthquake that shifted the entire field.
Yeah.
He completely changed the conversation from just observing what people say, the text, the utterances, the final product, to trying to figure out the underlying machinery, the internal hidden mechanism that allows us to generate an infinite number of sentences.
Precisely. And New Horizons is a collection of essays that he wrote years later, and it was designed to consolidate his core arguments and, just as importantly, to confront and clear up what he calls the confusion and prejudice that had infected the philosophical and psychological study of language since that revolution began.
So he's responding to a kind of lingering resistance.
A deep institutional resistance.
And what was that intellectual environment? What was the status quo before Chomsky came along?
It was overwhelmingly dominated by behaviorism in psychology, which basically insisted that all human behavior, including verbal behavior, had to be understood entirely in terms of stimulus and response.
Observable input, observable output, nothing in between.
Nothing in the black box of the mind was considered fair game for science. And alongside that, you had a pretty radical form of philosophical empiricism, which argued that basically all knowledge, including our knowledge of language, has to derive from sensory experience, from input.
So the model was a child is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, and if I want to know what language is, I look outside of myself. I look at society, at the corpus of utterances, at the physical events that connect words to things in the world.
Yes. They were preoccupied with the word world relation. How do symbols map onto external reality? That was the big question. These externalist views believed that meaning and knowledge of language came from outside, from social context, from observable behavior. The object of study was e-language, the external artifact.
Chomsky just flips that script entirely.
He argues that the whole external focus is scientifically unsustainable.
Okay, so let's state his central thesis as clearly as we can, because it is radical.
The core argument is this. Language is not primarily learned through imitation or social input. Instead, it arises from internal biological structures that constrain and generate linguistic expression. The ability to use language is rooted in a highly specific, genetically determined endowment that all humans share.
It's a biological phenomenon, fundamentally, like our visual system or our immune system. It's an organ of the mind-brain.
Yes, and this is where the terminology gets really crucial. Chomsky argues that there is, and I'm quoting here, no coherent notion of language external to the human mind that is suitable for scientific study. The proper focus has to be the mental construct that makes up our knowledge of language.
Which he calls I language.
He calls it I language. For internal, individual, and intentional meaning, it's concerned with the underlying structure, not just the observed output. This I language is a psychological object and ultimately a biological object that has to be studied with the same rigorous methods we use in the natural sciences.
But wait a second. If I language is individual and internal, how can we even talk about English or Mandarin as these shared objective things? I mean, doesn't communication itself imply some kind of shared external system? This feels like a key point of confusion.
It is. It is the source of enormous confusion. And to illustrate this conceptual shift, to show why that traditional view of language is scientifically bankrupt, he uses this deceptively simple analogy, the library analogy.
The War and Peace example.
Exactly. So imagine a library has two physical copies of Tolstoy's War and Peace.
Yeah.
Two different people check them out. The question is, did they take out the same book or a different book?
Well, if you view the book as a material object, the paper, the ink, the specific copy, they took out two different books. They're physically distinct.
Right. But if you view the book as an abstract entity, the story, the narrative, the sequence of ideas, they absolutely took out the same book. The identity of the book changes depending on your perspective.
So Chomsky's argument is that the traditional external view of language, what he calls e-language, is just as slippery. It's inadequate for science because it mixes up these different notions.
It's like talking about War and Peace as a physical object. It's useful for the librarian who needs to catalog it, but it's totally useless for the literary theorist who's trying to analyze the narrative structure.
So if we study the human capacity for language by just cataloging texts and correcting surface errors, we're only studying the paper and ink.
And worse. E-language relies on these disparate, often obscure external things like social norms, political boundaries, or historical accidents to define its boundaries. The identity of a language like English is fixed by human institutions, not by biology.
Right.
So the only coherent object for a natural science investigation is the internal mental object, the I language, the generative system that's actually instantiated in the brain.
That sets the stage beautifully. So we've established the proper object of study, the internal competence. Now let's dive into the core analysis of that system. This shift from the external product to the internal mechanism really frames the four key insights of the internalist perspective. And we can follow our framework here of how an internal structure imposes a constraint, which then determines the outcome we observe.
Right.
Let's start with insight one, this core distinction between the internal system, I language, and the public artifact, E language.
So we reiterate the starting point, the structure. Knowledge of language is individualistic. It's internal to the mind-brain. That's I language. It's a psychological state, a state of the brain's language faculty.
Okay, so the constraint imposed by focusing on this internal state is that we have to abandon the traditional idea of language, e-language, as a public construct. Beyond the War and Peace analogy, why exactly does that external view fail the scientific test? What makes it incoherent?
It fails because you can't define it with uniform objective principles.
Yeah.
Just consider the boundaries between languages. We talk about German and Dutch as two distinct languages, right? They're fixed by nation states, by institutions, and yet people who live along the border often speak dialects that form a continuum. They can communicate perfectly well with their neighbors across the border. But often, people in different regions of Germany can't understand each other at all. Same in China.
So the line between language A and language B is political and sociological. It's not computational or biological.
Precisely. If we're trying to understand the principles governing the generative mechanism, we need a uniform, predictable object of study. E-language relies on external, messy concerns, social norms, political decisions, history, that change all the time. It's too messy to formalize.
And that leads directly to the outcome.
The outcome is that the study of language has to shift entirely from external observation, from texts and behavior to the inner mechanisms. This integration of the study of the mind-brain with human biology is what we now call biolinguistics. We're searching for the physical implementation of language in the brain.
So the goal is to find the common abstract operating system that's shared by all human brains, instead of just cataloging the infinite number of apps that are running on it.
That's a great way to think about it. And that search for the common operating system leads us straight to the most powerful argument for innateness: the poverty of the stimulus, or POS.
Right, this is insight 2.
If the generative system is so rich, it implies a really complex initial structure, the genetically determined initial state of the language faculty, which is known as universal grammar, or UG.
And the constraint that forces us to accept this huge innate structure is just the simple observation of children. They acquire this vast, delicate, intricate knowledge of language on the basis of evidence that's just not good enough.
Not even close. The input they get is messy. Children are not exposed to perfectly grammatical sentences all the time, and they aren't constantly being corrected on abstract principles. And yet, they master the core syntax and semantics of their native tongue incredibly quickly. They are acquiring knowledge that goes way beyond what the external input provides.
Can you give us that extended example you mentioned before, the one that makes this abstract knowledge so clear? How does a child acquire such intricate knowledge about a simple word like house?
Okay, let's stick with house. When you watch a child acquire this word, they're not just learning a sound meaning link. They're learning this intricate network of concepts about its material constitution, its design, its use. So in the phrase, John is painting the house brown, they know immediately that it's the exterior surface being painted.
Right, they don't try to paint the inside of the walls.
And you could argue that's just common sense, learned from watching people paint houses.
It seems like simple learning, yeah.
But here's the critical distinction, the part that defies simple learning. The child also understands that if a person is standing inside the house, equidistant from the wall, that person is not considered near the house.
Wait, say that again?
We might say the dog is near the house when it's outside. But if I ask, is the dog near the house when it's sitting inside, right up against the wall, the linguistic answer is no.
That is bizarre. Physically, the dog is as near as it's possible to be. But linguistically near the house implies something about proximity to the external boundary, or the concept of the house as an external structure.
It's a deeply abstract conceptual rule, not a physical measurement rule.
And no one teaches them that.
No parent sits down and explains, "My dear child, note that near applies only to external surfaces when referring to a dwelling, overriding simple physical distance." It just doesn't happen.
So since the child's input, the stimulus, is too poor to derive this complex rule by just, induction or averaging what they've heard, the outcome must be that the knowledge of the structure of concepts like house and near is deeply innate.
Exactly. Language acquisition in its core grammatical and conceptual sense is like the growth of organs. It's something that happens to a child determined by their biological starting state, not something the child does purely through learning.
That is a staggering implication, because if the constraints are so powerful and the initial structure is so rich, it leads to that really striking conclusion you mentioned about uniformity.
Yes. If all humans are biologically endowed with this massive UG, then all human languages are, fundamentally, cast in the same mold. A rational Martian scientist could land on Earth, study the generative mechanisms in human brains, and reasonably conclude there is only a single human language, with differences that are just on the surface.
It totally shifts our perception of linguistic diversity.
Completely.
Okay, so that brings us to insight 3. We have this tension. UG has to be uniform and rich, but on the surface, human languages look wildly diverse. How can we hold on to the idea of an invariant core structure when a sentence in Japanese looks nothing like a sentence in English?
This is the historical challenge of linguistics. The search for what's called explanatory adequacy, which means showing how all the data you observe derives from an underlying invariant mechanism, requires the structure to be invariant at its core. But you also have to account for the surface complexity. That's called descriptive adequacy.
Explanatory adequacy versus descriptive adequacy. Can you give us a quick analogy for that? Because that's a key distinction that's often overlooked.
Sure. Imagine you're studying the movement of planets. Descriptive adequacy is Kepler's model. He charts the elliptical paths precisely. He can state that the orbit of Mars is an ellipse with these specific dimensions. It accurately describes what's happening.
Got it.
Explanatory adequacy, however, is Newton's law of universal gravitation. It's a single, simple principle that explains why all those elliptical paths occur and allows you to predict every path from a single formula.
Ah, okay. So the externalist view was stuck on descriptive adequacy, just cataloging the thousands of rules for English, Japanese, Swahili. Chomsky is looking for the underlying Newton's law for language.
Exactly. And the solution he proposes, which serves as the core constraint on the system, is the principles and parameters, or P&P approach. This system just rejects the whole idea of having unique language-specific rules, like thousands of separate rules for forming the passive voice.
So what's the alternative?
The initial state, UG, is seen as a fixed network of principles. That's the unchanging core computational structure, like Newton's law. And it's connected to a highly constrained, limited switchbox of options called parameters.
The switchbox idea is so powerful. It explains how you can get profound diversity from minimal variation. It's like a computer program that can have billions of outcomes just based on the settings of a few dozen on-off switches.
That's the core metaphor. Every human child is born with the entire UG, all the principles. But during the first few years, as they're exposed to language input, their brain sets the switches.
Can you give an example of a switch?
A classic one is the pro-drop parameter. It's basically a switch for whether a language allows you to drop the subject of a sentence. If the switch is set to plus pro-drop, you get Spanish or Italian, where you can just say canto, which means I sing.
Right, the I is implied.
But if it's set to pro-drop, you get English, where you have to explicitly say I sing. You can't just say sing.
So specific languages like Italian or Korean are the outcome of just choosing a particular combination of switch settings. A small change in one parameter can then ripple throughout the entire grammar, making the languages look radically different on the surface.
But the deep computational system is fundamentally the same. It dramatically restricts what a child has to learn. Instead of learning thousands of rules, they just need to learn the vocabulary and figure out how this small, finite set of parameters are set. Variation gets localized to a very narrow part of the language.
That search for explanatory adequacy, for finding the simplest and most powerful principles, culminates in the minimalist program. This is Insight 4.
Right. This is a radical effort to understand the efficiency of the language faculty's design. The structure here begins with the fact that language has to integrate with the rest of the mind and brain.
It can't exist in a vacuum.
It has to interact seamlessly with two major external systems of the mind. The articulatory perceptual system, or AP, for sound and speech, and the conceptual intentional system, CI, for thought, meaning, and planning.
And those systems place demands on the language output. You can't just generate pure thought. It has to be translatable into sound or sign, and it has to be structured in a way that our thought processes can interpret it.
Precisely. And that's the core constraint. The output of the language generator has to satisfy legibility conditions for both the AKI system and the CI system. The minimalist program is a radical hypothesis that asks, how perfect or optimal is the design of language given these unavoidable legibility conditions?
How close does it come to what a super engineer would build?
Exactly.
This is fascinating because we usually think of biological evolution as messy, full of historical accidents and redundancies, not elegant design. If language turns out to be optimal, that would challenge our standard perception of biological complexity.
It would be a profound finding. The minimalist program tries to show that the apparent imperfections in language, the things that look like messy evolutionary compromises, can actually be explained away as necessary consequences of satisfying those external constraints.
What are some of those classic imperfections, the things that make language look messy on the surface?
Two big ones are uninterpretable features and displacement. Uninterpretable features are elements that have a grammatical function but no semantic meaning on their own. For example, the tense marker on a verb in English. It only exists to enforce grammatical agreement. It doesn't really add unique meaning. They seem like computational noise.
It's like grammatical baggage the system has to carry around, which makes it seem inefficient.
Exactly. And the other one is displacement. This is the phenomenon where phrases appear in one position for articulation, but we logically interpret them somewhere else. Think of a simple question. Who did John see? Logically, who is the object of see, but we displace it to the beginning of the sentence.
Right. We don't say John saw who unless we're surprised or asking for clarification, but why does the structure have to allow for that movement? If the goal is optimality, why have that extra layer of complexity?
Well, the outcome that the minimalist program is trying to achieve is to reduce these two apparent imperfections, the uninterpretable features and displacement, down to a single, unified mechanism that's required to satisfy those external constraints.
How does that work? How do you connect computational noise with structural movement?
The current theory proposes that the uninterpretable features are the trigger for the movement. Their whole function is to drive the displacement process. So for instance, the CI system, the thought system, needs to know who the question is about. The AP system, the sound system, needs the question word to be in a prominent acoustic position at the front.
I see.
Movement displacement happens when an uninterpretable feature on one element essentially pulls another phrase into a different position to make the final structure legible to both of those external systems.
So displacement isn't just arbitrary complexity. It's the necessary computational step to take a simple underlying thought and format it into a sequence of sounds that both satisfies the ear and the interpretation system.
And if that radical conjecture is correct, and the minimalist program is a major research avenue today, it implies that the generative system of language isn't messy at all. It's optimal or perfect. It's the simplest possible solution to the problem of linking sound and meaning, given the fixed architecture of the human mind.
Wow, okay, so that is a highly detailed and frankly compelling argument for the internalist biolinguistic view. It seems to have immense explanatory power. And yet, the text makes it very clear that externalist models, the ones focused on surface behavior, on e-language, they persist. They remain profoundly influential across psychology, philosophy, and tech. So if the evidence for I-language is so strong, why does this externalist system of thinking continue to dominate institutionally?
To understand that, we need to map the systemic resistance. We can start with the actors involved. You have researchers who trained under the older paradigms, you have educators clinging to established methods, major testing institutions, philosophers with certain epistemological commitments, and critically today, the designers of modern AI systems.
And their incentives and narratives, they seem to strongly favor what's easiest to measure and what confirms what they already believe. There's an institutional preference for externally observable behavior, public utterances, texts, transcripts, because it offers immediate ease of measurement. It feeds institutional inertia.
And the dominant narratives are so appealingly simple. Language is learned. Input determines ability. Behavior explains mind. But the core intellectual resistance to Chomsky's theory is this institutionalized commitment to something called methodological dualism.
But let's slow down and define that clearly for everyone listening. Methodological dualism.
Methodological dualism is the view that studying human cognition requires abandoning the normal criteria we use for science in fields like physics or chemistry. It's this insistence that the study of human language must meet criteria that are different from or in addition to the criteria we use in all other scientific work.
Why? What makes the human mind so special that it requires its own restricted method of inquiry?
Historically, it's a philosophical commitment rooted in a kind of skepticism and materialism. The externalists, people like the philosopher Quine, were worried about postulating unobservable entities in the mind. If you can't physically point to a parameter setting or the deep structure of syntax, they argued, then it shouldn't be admitted as scientific evidence.
But that's absurd. A physicist can't point to a quark. A biologist can't point to a specific protein folding in real time. They use inference from all sorts of evidence to model an unobservable reality. Why is language different?
That is Chomsky's exact critique. The externalists impose these arbitrary stipulations. They say only observing an individual's behavior counts, and evidence from cross-linguistic studies like using facts about Japanese grammar to inform a theory of English grammar is disallowed.
But that guts the whole project.
It guts the possibility of discovering universal grammar, because UG is precisely that shared infrastructure that evidence from all languages should illuminate.
So this methodological limitation means they can't even see the problem that needs solving, like the poverty of the stimulus.
Exactly. Look at the specific example in the text about the coordinate structure constraint. This is a constraint that governs which parts of a compound sentence you can move to the front. So consider the difference between these two sentences. Who did John see Bill and?
That sounds wrong, unacceptable.
It is. But now consider, who did John see Bill with?
Perfectly acceptable, totally fine. But that distinction is incredibly subtle. It's governed by these abstract, complex principles that no child is ever explicitly taught.
A child acquiring English knows this difference, knows the first sentence is ill-formed, even though the input they get is way too limited and ambiguous to derive this by simple generalization. The knowledge has to be innate. And yet, when Quine was confronted with this, he suggested this uniformity is just due to a genetic kinship of languages, basically a historical family resemblance.
But that completely misses the point of the poverty of the stimulus. The issue isn't history, it's that the individual child, right now, has insufficient external evidence to learn this distinction from observation alone. It's an empirical problem that demands an innate solution.
A solution which the externalist simply rejects based on a self-imposed methodological constraint. And this adherence to dualism feeds directly into these really dangerous feedback loops. The surface explanations, the e-language models, they're easy to monetize, easy to test, easy to teach. So they reinforce teaching models like rote memorization. They reinforce institutional practices like standardized tests that only measure observable surface behavior instead of probing the underlying competence.
So the system prefers the easily measured, even if what's being measured is profoundly inaccurate about the reality of the language faculty.
That's the core inertia. The flawed loop persists because the externalist framework works well enough for everyday communication, just like our common sense language about the universe as the sun sets.
That institutional utility makes abandoning the inadequate yet functional framework extremely difficult, even when the empirical evidence, like the POS argument, demands a change in perception.
It's a powerful lock-in effect.
Okay, so if we accept this internalist view that I-language is a biological organ with a fixed, deep structure, what does this mean for the systems we all operate within today? Let's start with modern education systems and language acquisition.
Well, the primary implication is that the internalist view suggests language development is largely growth, not learning in the conventional sense. It's more like puberty or the development of your immune system. The internal structure just unfolds, triggered by minimal environmental experience.
That really challenges the traditional educational philosophy, which often treats grammar mastery like learning arithmetic, a series of rules you have to consciously memorize and apply.
Precisely. It suggests that focusing educational resources solely on maximizing external input or correcting surface behavior might be fundamentally misdirected. If the underlying grammar is fixed by UG and set by parameters early on, trying to force students to consciously apply grammar rules that run counter to their innate principles might be really inefficient for achieving actual competence, even if it helps them pass a specific test.
The goal should shift from teaching rules to providing the optimal environment for that natural growth process to happen.
Exactly.
And what about the concept of correctness? Institutions like the French Academy or dictionary editors, they define what constitutes a common language or community norms.
And those standards are, useful for pedagogy, for social cohesion, for establishing communicative standards. But the text really stresses that these external standards, this idealization of e-language, are utterly useless for a scientific inquiry into the nature of the language faculty itself.
The scientist studies how language is, not how some institution says it should be.
Right. The I-language perspective focuses on the reality of the internal state, whether it conforms to those transient, externally imposed norms or not.
That leads directly to how we build our technological systems. Let's connect this to AI and machine learning assumptions. Modern AI, especially large language models, LLMs, they rely so heavily on vast data sets of text, of observed behavior, to predict the next word in a sequence.
It's the quintessential modern implementation of the externalist behaviorist view. AI models get incredibly good at statistical prediction based on surface data on the e-language corpus. They demonstrate phenomenal descriptive adequacy.
But the question is, if language is truly a deeply constrained internal computational system I-language, can these purely statistical models ever attain true explanatory competence? Or are they fundamentally limited?
Chomsky's framework would suggest they are limited in a very profound way. If the core mechanism relies on abstract principles like structure dependence or the optimality conditions of the minimalist program that are just not statistically present in the messy finite surface data, then simply scaling up the dataset will not help you.
It's the difference between predicting where the planets will be tomorrow based on observing 10,000 previous positions versus knowing Newton's law and being able to predict their position indefinitely.
An excellent analogy. LLMs are highly efficient descriptive machines. They can generate novel, grammatical, plausible text because they track statistical likelihoods across their vast corpus. But they lack the innate, constrained generative machinery that imposes structure and determines what is possible in language, not just what is probable.
They might never truly grasp meaning or generate novel thought in a human-like way because they don't share the I-language structure.
They are experts in performance, but they lack competence.
Finally, let's look at intelligence testing and cognitive measurement. The concept of eye language as a biological organ really supports this idea of modularity, that the language faculty is a dedicated, specialized system separate from our general cognitive mechanisms.
And the evidence for that modularity is striking. It shows a clear dissociation between language mastery and general intelligence. The source highlights the case of Christopher, an individual who was severely cognitively deficient. His IQ was quite low, he couldn't do basic tasks like buttoning a shirt, and yet he was a language savant. He could master and translate up to 16 languages with ease.
That means the mechanism responsible for acquiring and using the deep, complex structure of a new language must be functioning independently of whatever governs motor skills, or planning, or general problem solving. It's like an isolated genius.
And conversely, the text mentions a case study of Laura, who had appropriate social skills and could use language generally okay, but she lacked emotional understanding and certain types of conceptual reasoning. Her language ability was intact, but the systems it was supposed to feed into, the conceptual intentional systems, were compromised.
This dissociation just fundamentally challenges traditional intelligence testing, which so often assumes unified cognitive abilities. The idea that if you're smart across the board. If the language organ operates autonomously, then your overall IQ might tell you nothing about the health of the language faculty itself.
And we have to emphasize, measuring linguistic knowledge is not about conscious awareness. The speaker, Mary, as the book says, uses incredibly complex principles of grammar all day long, like binding principles, distinguishing the he in "he thinks Bill is a nice guy" versus the woman he married thinks Bill's a nice guy. But she is entirely unable to articulate those rules consciously.
So if an intelligence test asks her to explain the rule for pronoun reference, she would fail, even though she successfully applies that exact rule thousands of times a day.
Exactly. Theories, including criticisms from philosophers like Searle or Nagel, that demand conscious access to rules as a criterion for knowledge, are just adopting another form of methodological dualism. They mistakenly dismiss the generative grammar, the eye language, as only physical rather than a legitimate, active psychological reality of the mind. The rules exist in the mind, even if we can't introspect them.
This entire deep dive brings us right back to the project's core focus: how systems shape perception, and how flawed models can persist even when there are superior explanatory alternatives. Let's start with systems versus individual blame.
In the traditional externalist systems, the moment an individual's linguistic behavior deviates from the public norm, whether it's a child saying, "I ride my bike," or a non-native speaker using the wrong past tense, it's immediately labeled as an individual error, a misuse, a failure of knowledge of the public language. The system blames the individual.
But the I language perspective completely reframes that. The individual isn't necessarily failing. They are perfectly following the rules of their specific I language, which just might not conform to some transient, externally imposed community norm.
The child who says, "I righted," is demonstrating a deep, innate knowledge of the regular past tense rule. They're just applying it over regularly. They're following a rule, one that the external standard has arbitrarily marked as incorrect because it failed to account for a minor lexical exception.
The focus shifts entirely from the individual's failure to the inadequacy of the externalist model, the E-language model, for describing reality.
The system of public norms is failing to recognize the deeper generative competence that's at work.
Which brings us to why flawed models persist. If the internalist model offers so much more explanatory power and better accounts for the evidence, like POS, why does the institutionally convenient externalist model continue to dominate education and tech?
It's because externalist models, rooted in observable data, they just conform to our common sense perspectives, to what we might call folk science. They are functionally adequate for day-to-day life. We talk about the sun setting and rising because that folk language is functional, even though scientifically we know the Earth is rotating.
Right. And E-language models work well enough institutionally for basic communication and teaching, and they offer these immediate, quantifiable measurements.
The moment you try to shift to measuring the unobservable I language, the cost, the complexity, the conceptual difficulty just skyrockets. So the institutional utility of the inadequate simple framework outweighs the scientific requirement for the adequate complex one. This inertia creates a huge barrier to shifting perception.
It's a powerful systemic loop. Flawed models that are easy to measure reinforce themselves through funding and pedagogical acceptance, and that stifles the adoption of the scientifically rigorous but more demanding alternatives.
It's a classic case.
And finally, let's look at how perception is shaped by measurement. The source material clearly suggests that our perception of something as fundamental as language diversity is entirely shaped by what the system chooses to measure.
When research is limited to surface phenomena to e-language, two-text languages appear incredibly complex and radically diverse. It seems like you need language-specific rules for every single construction. This surface complexity reinforces the idea that language is infinitely variable and mostly learned through culture. The focus is on difference.
But when you adopt the naturalistic methodology, when you look at the internal constraints, at universal grammar, at principles and parameters, the perception shifts entirely.
The underlying cognitive reality is revealed to be one of striking uniformity and simplicity. The perception changes from one of massive, daunting diversity to one of highly constrained, minimal variation. The true differences are, as the text says, only at the margins, mostly localized to little inflectional features and the arbitrary sound-meaning links of vocabulary.
And that unified perspective is only accessible when we overcome methodological dualism and commit to treating the language faculty as a biological object.
That's the key.
This deep dive into new horizons and the study of language and mind leaves us with a strikingly different view of human cognition and the systems we build around it. What are the key takeaways about ourselves and the world that this work helps us see differently?
Well, firstly, we see human language as a dedicated, specialized organ, a module of the mind whose deep structure is biologically fixed and largely innate. This is a total rejection of the unified general intelligence model.
Secondly, there's that paradox of constraint versus freedom. The apparent, almost miraculous freedom of linguistic expression, that infinite use of finite means that lets us say things no one has ever heard before. It arises, paradoxically, from these highly constrained internal principles. Our creativity is tightly bounded by innate biological structure.
And thirdly, I think this work really demonstrates how scientific explanation often lags significantly behind the empirical evidence. Chomsky notes that we now have the conceptual tools generative grammar, the minimalist program, to even ask questions about language perfection and design that were previously unformulable. The theory is constantly playing catch-up to the puzzle of human behavior.
We've made huge progress in understanding linguistic competence, the I-language structure itself, but Chomsky divides the entire intellectual world into things we can potentially solve, which he calls problems, and things that may lie perpetually beyond our intellectual capacities, which he calls mysteries. So after all this research, what remains a mystery?
The mechanisms of the language faculty, or competence, are now firmly established as problems that we can solve using the natural sciences. But our understanding of how we put that competence to use, our performance, is still largely a closed book. That, for him, is the realm of mystery.
So why we choose to say one thing rather than stay silent?
Or why we choose one perfectly grammatical structure over another, or how free will and consciousness interact with this constrained generative system. These questions involve the interaction of I-language with the conceptual intentional systems in a way we just cannot yet articulate scientifically.
That is a profound reflection. That human intelligence, like that of any biological organism, is bound by its own inherent limitations. And some of the deepest questions about how we use this incredible capacity for language may simply remain forever beyond the reach of our scientific insight. The ultimate system that defines us might be too complex for us to fully comprehend.
An excellent point of departure for your own continued thinking.
We have been exploring the radical shift in perspective proposed by Noam Chomsky, drawing on his collected essays, New Horizons in the Study of Language and Mind. We encourage you to seek out this book for a rigorous and detailed look at these concepts, or check it out from your local library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.